Hi, everyone. My name is Adrian Harpold. I'm an associate professor at the University of Nevada in Reno, where I run the Nevada Mountain Ecohydrology Lab. And today I will be presenting work we've done and others have done on state-of-the-art in modeling the effects of forest thinning on snow and stream flow. And I've had some great collaborators throughout this work. A postdoc who's worked with me, Sebastian Crow, uh, Patricia Manley, who's at the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, Hamadeh Safa, who's a PhD student working with me, and Patrick Broxton, who's a research scientist at the University of Arizona. So where are we going today? Well, we'd like to answer one broad question. It's kind of a billion-dollar question, multi-billion. How do water stores and flows change after you thin a forest? And this really, I'm going to show you, is a complicated question to answer that requires a number of things, of which I'm going to highlight snow-forest interactions and subsurface processes. And then I'm going to look at how do we address challenges in forest management that require immediate action in the face of scientific uncertainty arising from these challenging predictions we're trying to make. And then I'm going to highlight with 3 examples how we might use new technologies and tools to increase our ability to predict and manage forest systems. So water budgets change after we thin a forest. And it's going to depend, obviously, on what was there before we thin the forest and what happened after we thin the forest. But this nice figure by Sarah Goking in a recent paper shows that you can get increased stream flow, which is this left-hand Q, or decreased stream flow. And that's basically a result of how evapotranspiration, or ET, changes. And ET itself is a function of a number of terms that have to do with transpiration and evaporation from the canopy, as well as transpiration and evaporation from the understory and from the soil. And what I'll try to make the case is this is a complicated spatially dependent problem. So when we think about managing for forest change, we have to account for the challenges of making these predictions. So the first example I'll give is about snowpack and some of these challenges. So you have counteracting processes when you have a forest over snow. You have snow being caught in the branches, which we call interception. We have sheltering from energy, and so that occurs from shading, but also how forests change wind patterns. And then those trees can also warm up and emit long-wave radiation. And as a consequence of this, we see some predictable patterns when we remove, or in some cases, grow forest cover. So generally, when we remove forest cover on the left-hand side of these figures, we get less snow. When we remove forest cover, we get more snow accumulating, and we get a faster snow melt. And the opposite is generally true when we have greater forest cover. But there's a tremendous amount of variability across these different studies. This is a synthesis of many studies, suggesting that there's a lot of local scale effects. And we're going to spend some time talking about these effects, but I'll highlight them here with some LiDAR snow depth data. And these have to do with the small or fine scale interactions between the tree canopy and snow. And so 3 sets of processes I'm illustrating here. When the canopy is large, you can get wind redistributing the snow. In a smaller canopy gap, you get this effect of shading and sublimation driven by radiation. And in these very small forest gaps, you get preferential accumulation because you have less interception. And so these effects get propagated across a large landscape. And when we start to alter the forest canopy with thinning or other disturbances, how these fine-scale forest effects then change the snowpack can be quite complicated, and I will make more of a case for that over the next couple minutes. The other example that I want to show is stream flow, and how stream flow is a complicated response. So stream flow integrates all of these evapotranspiration terms. So clearly there's a lot that can change more than even the change in snowpack would be just one individual or set of terms in this water budget. And so this synthesis by Goking et al. Is showing that stream flow has a mixed response across previous studies, where sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases, sometimes it doesn't change. And the same is true for peak flows and low flows. So it really gets at the complexity and the local watershed scale effects on stream flow. And the complexity that I'm going to highlight here, that I think is one of the primary uncertainties we have, is what's going on underground and subsurface processes, both from a storage and a transport or flux point of view. And what I'm showing here is work by Naomi Tegg using the rhesus model, where she's allowing water to move laterally down this hill slope in the model, or she's not. She's basically turning that on and off in the model. And when she has the redistribution on, there is more evapotranspiration in the system, and there is more variability spatially. And so the point I'm trying to make with this is that in order to get the effects of evapotranspiration correct, we need to correctly do lateral redistribution in these subsurface processes. Okay, so we have these scientific challenges and uncertainties, maybe opportunities if you're a researcher like myself. But we're also faced with on the ground challenges about managing our forests. And I don't think it needs a lot of prelude right now, at least in my part of the world, with all the fires in the Sierra Nevada. But we have, I'm going to show example from the Tahoe West project, which is the west shore of Lake Tahoe. I think it's characteristic of many large-scale forest restoration projects where you're trying to manage a number of benefits. Fire being probably the primary one, but a number of other ones, including water. And so I was part of this project trying to look at the effects of forest thinning on water, specifically snow retention, snow water inputs, and stream flow. And just kind of setting up the rest of the talk, you know, how are we going to do this in the face of all the scientific uncertainty and challenges that have kind of set us up with? And I guess my short answer to that is we're going to need to develop new tools and new techniques, and I'm going to show you three kind of that are examples of things we've been working on. So a new technology, relatively speaking, is LiDAR, which uses an active light source from an airplane to get a three-dimensional structure. That was the data I was showing you before. And so what my student Hamide Safa has done is has taken this and turned it into a fractional snow-covered area, or FSCA, and then is showing this in the under canopy. So when you're under a tree canopy, so you can see the difference here, near the tree or in the open, what the fractional snow cover is. And she shows, consistent with some other work, that you have higher fractional snow cover at the warmer sites in the Sierra Nevada in the open, whereas at the colder sites, you tend to have greater fractional snow cover under canopy, the colder sites being in New Mexico and Colorado. But this data allows us to go a lot more levels down, because the LiDAR data also measures forest structure. And so with forest structure, we can say things about the effects of vegetation density. We can also use the LiDAR data to tell us about topography. And so we're able to really pull apart the controls on fractional snow cover area in these different sites. And so we see a really strong effect of vegetation density where just generally there's more snow, where there's less vegetation, but it also controls the effects of topography. And so from this, Hamide has been able to draw some conclusions about forest management, forest thinning effects, where we see greater potential at the warmer sites for removing trees in terms of increasing fractional snow cover area. And also, particularly at the warmer sites, we see greater potential on south-facing slopes for removing trees and increasing increasing snow retention. Okay, so the second example is going to also use these LiDAR data sets, but is going to use these within a snowpack energy budget model. And so I won't go into details about this, but state-of-the-art in snowpack modeling is to have a energy and water budget closure model, but we're doing this at 1 meter. So that allows us to account for individual trees, the shading from individual trees, those different gap sizes that I was showing in that LiDAR data set. And I won't go into the details of this model. There's several papers out there with Patrick Broxton's original paper in 2015, probably being the primary citation. So what are we doing with this? We're working on the west shore of Lake Tahoe as part of this project. The first thing we wanted to do was demonstrate to ourselves as well as our partners that the model represented reality. So we went out and made some measurements near a snowtel site. We were able to reproduce a range of snow depth and energy conditions. Then we applied these virtual thinning experiments where we were able to use the LiDAR data set to remove tree canopy in a systematic way by removing trees under certain heights and then rerunning the model. And so that allowed us to then break down how different parts of the water budget change when you remove the tree canopy. So Sebastian work that's published in Frontier shows that you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck where you have high leaf area index relative to a moderately tall forest. So you can think of these as moderately tall forests that are very dense. The taller forests tend to self-thin, it appears, and be a little more efficient, less useful to thin there. And the smaller forests, you tend to not be able to get the benefit of shading from the trees that remain. And so we see the largest benefits at lower elevations, generally because the trees were denser there in Lake Tahoe, and greater benefits on south-facing slopes, which was consistent with the work I showed you using independent LiDAR snow depth data. So what do we do with this data? We put it into a random forest model to try to streamline it down into something that makes sense. And we provide a series of decision support tools to the larger project management team to do targeted restoration and provide really specific recommendations. And then from a scientific point of view, it allows us to put some of the historical plot studies into context. So this is showing that same data set that shows a synthesis of previous studies. And we're showing that we can explain a lot of the variability in this previous data set, specifically in the Sierra Nevada, with model results just from these two catchments in the west shore of the lakes, suggesting that there's a space-time variability that we can capture with these models that haven't been captured before. Okay, and I have one last example I'll try to go through here quickly, which is that to really know how the water budget is going to respond, we need to estimate evapotranspiration. And we have new tools coming online to do that. I'm going to show some results from an energy budget model that you can use a thermal image to estimate UAV and space-based evapotranspiration fields. So we've done this at a field site and shown some intriguing results where we're getting a very fine scale evapotranspiration pattern. We can see the canopy cooling itself via evapotranspiration, so evidence of evapotranspiration in our data, but we don't really see the resolution and sensitivity that we do in the observed sap flow data, suggesting that there's still some refinement in these techniques probably before they can be applied for management purposes. So a couple closing thoughts here that I think I've said earlier in the talk. We're increasingly forced to make management decisions that are time dependent, but in the face of scientific uncertainty. And I think there's a need to develop ecohydrology science in tandem with management goals. And I think this development is really going to force us to use new technology to really consider these fine scale processes and the challenges of things that are difficult to observe. So thank you for your time and for running over a bit.